This is our continuous lap sample. So as you can see here, the function of the continuous lap is to allow the cuff to open, but also to finish off the edges of the seam that is placed in the middle of the sleeve. So for this sample, we have two pattern pieces. We have the body and the bias lap that we will use to finish off the cut of the seam. There are 3 markings that you have to place inside of the pattern, and then also 3 notches at the bottom of the body. Please pay attention to the grain lines on these pattern pieces, as you will be having to cut this on the bias and this one on the grain, or straight grain. The first step will be to mark your pattern. So you want to start out by poking a hole into your pattern piece right here using an awl. You can also use a sharp pencil. Just poke right through to make sure that it comes out on the other side. And when you mark your piece, you just mark straight through those points. And also be sure to clip the bottom of your notches by only 1/8 of an inch. You'll also want to mark the 1/4 inch seam allowance on your bias tape. The next step is to connect all of those marks that you just made. So you want to create the shape that is on the pattern piece. So you'll connect the left and right points down to the left and right notches, and the center point down to the center notch. You're also going to connect the 3 points at the top, making a small triangle. And these middle points here indicate your cutting lines. On step number 3, we're going to be stitching along the outside line, and we're going to use a very small stitch. So about a 1.5 to 2 millimeter stitch, turning the knob on the machine all the way down. After this step, you will then cut into the middle lines. So you're going to cut all the way up to that point at the bottom of the triangle, and then you're going to cut diagonally up to the corners of those lines there. And that will allow you to fully open up this cut nice and straight so that you can sew the bias directly across that point. Step number 5 is to line up your bias along that reinforcement stitch that you made. So you're going to line up this reinforcement stitch exactly on top of the 1/4 inch seam allowance guide that you drew onto your bias tape. Now if you notice towards the center, once you pin this, the raw edges will not line up exactly. And that's because these lines that you had for your reinforcement stitch angle up at the top of that piece. So your seam allowance, when laid flat, starts off at a 1/4 inch, dips down to about a 1/16 of an inch, and then back up to a 1/4. So when you use that bias tape, although the raw edges line up at the edge here, they will not at the center. And you have to be very careful of that. And that's why we have to pin it in place before we stitch, just to make sure everything's lined up before we start stitching. Step number 6 will be to sew the bias tape directly onto the body of the sample. Now when you sew this, you want to make sure that your reinforcement stitch is facing up. And you're going to stitch directly next to that reinforcement stitch on the outside. So when I say next to, you don't want to be closer to the edge of the seam allowance, you want to be on the edge closest to the body, like this. And what this does is after you stitch the bias to the body together, you won't see that reinforcement stitch underneath that seam. Now when you're stitching this, it gets really difficult once you get up towards the center, because you can see we have all of this excess in the sample here. As you're stitching up, you're going to want to leave your needle down right towards the edge of that corner. You'll lift up your presser foot, redisperse all of that ease, sew up the rest of that, the top of that shape, redistribute your ease again, and then stitch all the way down, continuing directly to the left of that stitch. So then you'll have the bias totally connected to the body, and then we'll start pressing to finish off that bias binding. Now, if you turn the sample over, what you'll want to do is press the seam allowance up into the bias tape. So you'll pull all of the seam allowance here and crease it in towards the bias. Flip it over, make sure you crease that ditch in here, and that you don't want any pleating or lipping inside of the seam. You want it nice and flat. Once you get that pressed in, you're gonna take this top edge of the bias tape and fold that down to meet the raw edge of your seam allowance. So that gets folded down about 3/8 of an inch. And then you'll have this. So again, press that seam allowance up, press that down to meet your raw edge, and then we're gonna take the top fold of this bias tape and just press that down so that it covers that stitch, just like that. And then you're gonna pin that in place. So you can see here the fold of the bias covers that stitch line, like this. Then we'll stitch that down by pinning directly into the ditch, just like this. You wanna make sure that when you come through, you're getting the very edge of that bias tape, and then you can pin down onto the body like this. And that will ensure that the fold of your bias is passing that original stitch here, so that when you do stitch in the ditch, you are going to catch the edge of that fold. Step 9 is stitching in the ditch. You can leave this nice and straight. And you're gonna be stitching directly inside of that ditch. So between the bias and the body of the sample. You wanna be sure that you're getting the very edge of that bias tape all the way down so that it's nice and secured and looks super neat. Now you can tell when you lay this flat that it's sort of peeking up like this, and it doesn't really lay nice and smooth. So the next step will be to top stitch this lap inside of the garment. So we're gonna pull that bias tape inside like this, overlap like that, so that the underside is just going straight, and then this part of the lap is folded under, like this. So again, we started like this, push that lap to the underside, and overlap like this. And then you'll want to press that to keep it nice and straight and smooth. Now, the act of sewing the continuous lap into a piece of fabric with no seam is going to cause fullness at the top of this lap. So it's going to be hard to avoid that fullness at the top of the sample. So we're going to top stitch down that lap right here. And that will keep the lap inside of the sleeve and leaving everything nice and neat. To finish off the sample, you'll overlock the outside of the entire thing and label it continuous lap. The best way to find the perfect grain line is to use this cutting mat. So on these cutting mats, there's a 45-degree angle line going in both directions. And what you'll do is line up your lengthwise and your cross grain with the grid on the map, and you can sort of see underneath your muslin to follow the trace of that 45-degree line. If you can't see it through your muslin, you can cut a smaller piece and use a ruler to trace the beginning and the end of that line. And you can go ahead and use some chalk or a pencil to trace that grain line directly onto your muslin. Like this. Then you'll take your bias tape pattern piece and then line that up directly next to that line and cut. And this way, you'll get the full use of your bias on your muslin. Okay, so here's the best way to mark and clip your square of muslin for your continuous lap sample. So you may still have this pinned onto your muslin as you cut it. And I'm using pen just so that you can see better on the video, but you should use something a little less visible or temporary, such as chalk or a pencil. So I already poked the holes through with my awl. I'm just gonna go ahead and mark inside of those points. And then I'll use my snips to get in those notches. So I have 3 notches there, 3 dots here, a little uneven. Now we connect. Now connect to the top, and then those diagonal lines down to the center point. Okay, so my machine is threaded and on, all ready to sew, and we're going to start by doing the reinforcement stitch on the outer lines here. So the first step will be to turn down our stitch length about 1.5 to 2 millimeters. Start at one edge and pull back. Now when you get here, you may want to use the hand wheel crank to land the needle directly into the point at the top of that line. You'll leave your needle down, lift up your foot, pivot, and then stitch across the top. Same thing. Leave the needle down at that point, pivot, and stitch down. So now we have our reinforcement stitch done, and what this does is prevent the lap bias from pulling out of its seam. Because since our seam allowance gets so small, especially at the top part here, it is possible during continuous wear, washing and such, that bias tape will pull directly out of that fabric. So this reinforcement sort of stops the grain of the fabric from releasing and preventing the bias from coming out. The next step is going to be to cut along the center line and then up into the corners of our reinforcement stitch. So I like cutting that longer line with my shears, and then going in with my snips to cut into that corner because it is a lot more precise. Now you have to be really careful not to clip the stitches themselves. You also don't want to go too far away to allow it to open up all the way. Okay, so next step, we're going to line up the seam allowance line of our bias strip with the reinforcement stitch on the sample piece. Now you can line it up at one end. And the lap sample pattern is longer than the entire seam itself. So once you get this pinned on, you're gonna have about like 1 inch to 1.25 inches excess at the edge. And that's just to prevent this from gathering and being too small or anything like that. And you'll just cut that off at the end. So we'll line this up at one edge. We're gonna pin directly into the seam allowance. We want to make sure that it's going through the stitch line on the other side. And now you can keep going until you get to the top. If you hold this up to a lamp or use a tracing board, you can see underneath the bias strip where your stitches are laying to make sure that you're getting that nice and perfectly matched up. Now as you move up, the raw edge is going to start to move farther and farther from the raw edge of your bias tape. Remember that. So now when you get to the top, it gets a little tricky to get that pinned in nice and neatly. You're going to pin directly into this corner from the bias tape. You want to be really careful not to catch any of this extra fabric in here into that pinning so that you don't stitch in any pleats. Try to keep it nice and smooth under there. Pull any ease away from your pinning points. And move away. So here we are. There's quite a few pins in there, but they'll come in handy. Okay, so the next step is to stitch the continuous lap onto the body of the sample. And now we're going to turn our stitch length back up to normal, so 2.53. And then we're going to stitch directly on the left edge of this reinforcement stitch. So this is technically an edge stitch, and we're going to line up the reinforcement stitch with the inside edge of our presser foot. So line that up just like this, and follow this stitching line all the way along. And make sure that you stay to the left and pull out any ease that may get in your way. So back tuck and begin. Make sure you take out your pins. Okay, when you get to this point, you may want to start using the hand wheel to bring that needle right up into that corner. Leave the needle down, lift up your foot, and push all of that ease towards the back. Okay. And now I'm going to stitch across this top part right here. Right now my needle is in this point. I pivoted. I'm going to stitch across that 1/4 inch and leave my needle into that second point. So it's only going to be about 2 or 3 stitches. 1, 2, take out that pin, and 3. All right, I am in that second point. I'm going to pivot, move all my ease back, and continue edge stitching all the way down. Okay. So you can see here that the stitch I just made is just next to that first reinforcement stitch, all the way across. It hasn't caught any major pleats at the top or in those corners. And this right here is why I told you guys earlier to use chalk or a pencil or something that's temporary or erasable, because you may end up seeing the marking lines that you drew initially. Okay, so now we're gonna clip off this extra here. And we're gonna go over to the iron, press the seam allowance up into the bias, make it crisp, and then bind this off by folding this down and then twice. Okay, so here we are at the iron. I'm gonna lay this nice and flat. I'm gonna start at one end and press this down into that direction. Okay, so we got that pressed. We'll flip it over and see if we have any lips at the ditch of the seam. And we'll press everything out towards the bias. Okay, so now we begin our binding. We press this top raw edge down to the bottom raw edge, just like this. Press that along. Okay, so that's nice and neat. We're going to take this folded edge and bring it right over that line that we just stitched. Just like that. There we go. So that's nice and neatly pressed, crisp edge, and it's folded over our stitching line. So let's start pinning this down to make sure that this bias edge stays over the ditch of our seam. Now whenever we pin a ditch, we put the needle straight down into the seam and make sure that we're grabbing the very edge of that bias fold like this. So straight down, and then we turn and pin away from our bias tape. And that will catch the edge and hold it down over the ditch of our seam. We'll do that all the way across. Everything's nice and pinned in place. We can go ahead and do our ditch stitch. I'm gonna fix this one. When we're sewing, we're gonna drop the needle directly into that ditch. It's best to use the hand wheel to make sure that's nice and accurate. And then we're going to stitch directly inside of that fold of that seam. So basically on top of those initial stitches that secured the bias to our seam. I can sort of feel right next to that ditch that the fold of the bias is coming beyond it. That's really important that you feel just a little bit of that to make sure that you're catching everything. when you get to this top point, do the same thing as you did before. Leave your needle in, lift up the foot, sort of transfer that ease. So 3 stitches, and do it again. So here's your stitch in the ditch. It should be basically invisible. If you were using a matching thread, you wouldn't be seeing this on the right side of your sample. Now on the other side, you can see that I perfectly caught the very edge of that bias. Now for our top stitch, we have 2 different options. For both, you will want to press this bias tape under and towards the back, press in half, and flat. Just like this. So again, if your bias is like this, pull it down to the back, press in half, and then flat. Now, the first option is to top stitch just the lap itself together. So, revealing the lap here, you're gonna stitch on the top corner of that bias fold. Now you'll start about here and stitch up to that stitch in the ditch line here. If you're stitching, you don't want to go beyond this point or else you'll catch a pleat in the top. Now when doing a top stitch, I usually go over it about 2 or 3 times just to make sure it's nice and sturdy. And this will keep that tape from staying to the back of the sample. Now the other option is to top stitch directly on top of the body of that sleeve. And that will catch right on the back, but also show on the front and keep everything nice and flat.